We discussed what employers would like out of the employees that they hire. We also discussed that it's your job to sell yourself in the interview to show that you stand out, that you are extraordinary rather than being ordinary, and that you are the best person for the job, that you do possess those traits that workplace employers would like to have. What types of traits are those? Remember, we talked about being responsible. We talked about integrity. We talked about being honest. We talked about being punctual. We talked about individuals that use their time wisely or understand what time management means. We also talked about individuals that showed up to work every day and worked hard, because those are the things that employers would like to see in employees that they hire. And during your job interview, it's your responsibility to share them, and it's your responsibility to communicate that you possess those skills. Now, every time an employer hires an employee, sometimes they make mistakes. You can't always hire good employees. And so when behaviors are exhibited that are not in line with those desired characteristics, something must happen. What must happen? Well, let me just go ahead and tell you, you don't always fire the person. You don't want to fire individuals because it costs you money to retrain individuals that you have hired on your job. Therefore, you want to see if you can work with them and try to change the behaviors and mold them into the behaviors that you desire. There are certain types of things that we're going to discuss during the course of today's lesson that could take place at a job that would cause you to have to go through some type of behavior modification program. If you have an attitude, of course, that will be negative. Could cause you to possibly lose your job in a worst case scenario. Now, some of you might remember Mr. Shepard's pet peeve, and it deals with hugging. And I think I mentioned to you all the reason that I don't like hugging is because it can lead to something that would be known as sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is something that in the late 80s and early 90s became very evident with a court case that dealt with Clarence Thomas. It wasn't actually a court case. Clarence Thomas was a person who was nominated to the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas was accused of sexual harassment by one of his workers, Anita Hill. Since that time, lots of things and laws have been passed and rules have been passed that deal with what can and what cannot take place in the workplace. Sexual harassment is basically defined as anything that causes someone to feel uncomfortable that takes place while on the job. Today we're going to discuss sexual harassment. We will also discuss inappropriate violent behavior that could take place on the job, and we'll discuss things that must be done to try to rehabilitate or make a decision dealing with employees that are not following the directives or living up to the expectations of employers on the job. With no further delay, after this lengthy introduction, we'll now begin. In the course of today's lesson, we will discuss what happens when inappropriate behavior takes place in the workplace, what types of measures the employer can take, and what can happen in relationship to the employee as it relates to not performing up to par on the job. Yesterday, we discussed various things that employers desire out of the employees that they hire. Things as a positive attitude, responsibility, dependability, hard work, someone who dresses appropriately, and people that go the extra mile to be a good employee. Sometimes people are hired for jobs that for some reason it just doesn't work. Maybe they have a conflict of interest, or maybe the employer and them just don't get along. What happens when a situation like that happens, when an employee is not meeting the expectations of what the employer has? What can the employee do, and what does the employer do? In the next couple of slides, that's just what we'll be talking about. Most jobs have what is called an annual evaluation. This is an evaluation based on the job description that is outlined for the employee to be able to meet as it relates to the expectations of the job. The employer should conduct an annual evaluation. This annual evaluation should mark up how it is that the employee is doing on the job, and it should list them as doing a good, satisfactory job or possibly doing unsatisfactory. If for some reason they're doing unsatisfactory, the idea is that hopefully some type of plan of action to get them to the satisfactory level will be identified so that the employee can keep their job. If and when, for some reason, an employee is not working up to snuff, an employer might bring in that employee to have an oral conversation with them to discuss how they could correct the behavior. If this doesn't work, the next step would be to give a written letter of reprimand stating what the undesired behavior is and giving suggestions of what might be done to correct the behavior. If the behavior continues, they might be removed from work for a day or so and sent home without pay. If this doesn't work, Unfortunately, it might lead to an error when you might have to terminate the employee. Many of you are familiar with the show The Apprentice and Donald Trump and his famous lines, "You're fired." However, no employer really wants to fire an employee at any time. Please understand that when an employer makes the decision to terminate an employee's contract, it is usually a last resort, due to the inability to get that employee to be able to conform to whatever the desired behavior is for the tasks that are assigned to that employee. It is never fun to tell someone that you're fired, because you take away their ability to correctively and actively function in the economy. Back in the 1980s, there were several incidents where post office workers were fired, and in the afternoon after they were fired, they reported back to the post office, shooting and killing their immediate supervisors as well as some of their fellow employees. This became known as going postal. Going postal refers to workplace violence related to threats, physical assault, or in those cases, homicide. Post office workers resent this term because they don't like to be associated with negativity. For the most part, post office workers are great individuals. However, when livelihoods were taken in the 1980s, that did occur as it relates to the killing sprees in a couple of our towns in the United States. In today's world, it is also important that you understand that while you're on the job, inappropriate use of social media is something that you can be reprimanded and removed from your job for violating whatever the policy is related to that. It is also important that you get along with the individuals that you work with and that you don't fight on the job. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, sexual harassment is something that gained a lot of attention as it relates to the workplace. Sexual harassment is any unwanted advance that takes place related to male-male, female-female, female-male, or male-female. Any inappropriate type of innuendo that takes place related to sex that makes the other person feel uncomfortable is known as sexual harassment. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes it illegal to sexually harass anybody on their job. Anybody found in violation of that could be removed from their job. Sexual harassment is neither allowed in the workplace nor in the school. I have two pictures that I'm going to show you that illustrate sexual harassment in the workplace. They are not intended to be funny, but are intended to illustrate to you what can be considered as sexual harassment. In the first picture, you will see an individual who is being touched that feels uncomfortable. The fact that he feels uncomfortable makes it sexual harassment. In the next picture, you will see a young man gawking at a young lady. If this makes her feel uncomfortable, it is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment really began to gain a lot of attention during the early 1990s in the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas when he was nominated for the United States Supreme Court. During the time when he worked with a young lady by the name of Miss Anita Hill, he had several inappropriate conversations talking about pornography and talking about sex during the workday. This made her feel very uncomfortable, and when he was being confirmed to join the United States Supreme Court, she came forward. Sexual harassment is wrong. In the course of the lesson today, we discussed undesired workforce behaviors. We went on to discuss what could occur if you display some of those types of behaviors on the jobs, what the employer and what you might need to do to try to improve if your desire is to stay on that job. In addition, we talked about things that are not allowed on the job, such as sexual harassment. Today, you also should have taken the quiz. If you haven't already, you need to take the quiz over Lesson 1 of Module 2. Tomorrow we'll come in and we'll talk about diversity on the job, and then we'll tie up loose ends and get prepared for the test that will be the test over Module 2. Thank you very much for your attentiveness. I hope you have a great day.